The gunshot echoed across the valley, causing a flock of startled birds to take flight from the old apple orchard as Zachary Monroe dove behind a weather-beaten wagon wheel. Spring of 1875 had arrived in the Montana Territory with all its beauty, but this particular dawn had brought more than just birdsong to the outskirts of Silverwater. "Damn it all," Zach muttered, checking his Colt revolver before peering over his cover. The morning sun glinted off his dusty blonde hair as he scanned the horizon for his attacker. At 26, he'd been riding the range long enough to know that sunrise ambushes rarely ended well for either party. Another shot rang out, splintering wood mere inches from his face. Zach ducked down, calculating his options. The shooter was positioned somewhere near the east ridge, which meant crossing open ground to reach his horse tethered by the creek. Not ideal. "Monroe," a gruff voice called out. "That's for the cattle you stole from Bridger's ranch." "I don't steal cattle, Jenkins," Zach shouted back. "Check your brands again." He'd been accused of many things during his years drifting through the Western Territories, being a horse thief, a card cheat, even a ladies' man, but cattle rustling wasn't among his transgressions. The accusation stung more than he cared to admit. While Jenkins reloaded, Zach took his chance. He sprinted across the clearing, diving behind a cluster of rocks just as another bullet whizzed past. His breath came in ragged gasps as he considered his next move. The stand of apple trees was his best bet. At least there he'd have cover to work his way back to his horse. Gathering his courage, he darted toward the orchard, zigzagging between the trees until he reached the relative safety of their gnarled trunks. The ancient orchard had been planted by the first settlers decades ago, long before Silverwater was anything more than a cluster of hopeful homesteads. As he caught his breath against a twisted trunk, something caught his eye movement among the trees deeper in the orchard. Instinctively, he raised his pistol. "Don't shoot," a feminine voice called out. "Please." Zach lowered his weapon slightly but kept it ready. "Show yourself, madam." From behind a tree stepped a young woman clutching a wicker basket. Her chestnut hair was partially tied back, with loose strands framing a face that showed equal measures of fear and determination. Her simple blue dress, practical but well-made, suggested she wasn't from town. "What in God's name are you doing out here with someone shooting?" Zach demanded, his voice a harsh whisper. "I could ask you the same," she replied, surprisingly composed despite the circumstances. "This is my family's orchard." Before Zach could respond, another shot rang out and the woman gasped as bark exploded from a nearby tree. "Get down." Zach lunged forward, pulling her behind the broad trunk of an ancient apple tree. They crouched together, the woman's basket appended, early spring herbs scattered across the ground. "Jenkins," Zach called out. "There's a lady present, hold your fire." Silence followed for several long seconds. "You've got 5 minutes to clear out, Monroe," Jenkins finally shouted back. "And don't let me catch you on Bridger land again." The woman beside him trembled slightly, but her eyes, a striking shade of green, remained steady. "Are you a cattle rustler, Mr. Monroe?" "No, madam," Zach replied, tipping his hat back to get a better look at her. "Just a cowboy with poor timing and worse luck. The name's Zachary Monroe, though most folks call me Zach. I'm Nora Campbell." She extended her hand in a formal gesture that seemed oddly out of place while hiding behind a tree from a trigger-happy rancher. Zach took her hand, surprised by the strength in her grip, despite its softness. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Campbell, though I wish it were under better circumstances." He noticed her basket and the scattered contents. "I'm sorry about your herbs." "They're not going anywhere," she said with unexpected humor. "Unlike you, apparently. Do you make a habit of getting shot at in other people's orchards, Mr. Monroe?" Despite himself, Zach smiled. "Not as often as you might think." They waited several more minutes until they were certain Jenkins had ridden off. When Zach finally helped Nora to her feet, he noticed how the dappled sunlight through the apple blossoms cast patterns across her face. "You mentioned this is your family's orchard?" Zach asked, helping her retrieve the scattered herbs. Yes, the Campbell orchard. My father planted most of these trees, though some were here when he arrived. Pride tinged her voice. We're just east of the boundary with Bridger's ranch. That explains Jenkins' enthusiasm, Zach muttered. I was tracking some strays that wandered off from the herd I'm driving north. Must have crossed onto Bridger land without realizing. Nora studied him, her expression shifting from wariness to curiosity. You're driving cattle north, to Fort Benton? That's right. Working for the Hartwell outfit out of Wyoming. We're camped about 5 miles south by Eagle Creek. He dusted off his hat and placed it back on his head. I should be getting back before my boss sends out a search party. Wait, Nora said, touching his arm lightly. You're bleeding. Zach glanced down to see a tear in his shirt sleeve, a thin line of blood seeping through. It's nothing, just a graze. Nonsense, come to the house. It's just beyond the orchard. I'll clean that properly before you go. Her tone brooked no argument. Against his better judgment, Zach followed her through the orchard. He told himself it was merely to ensure she made it home safely after the shooting, but he couldn't deny his curiosity about this composed young woman who gathered herbs while bullets flew. The Campbell homestead emerged from beyond the final row of apple trees, a modest but well-maintained cabin with a stone chimney, a barn and several outbuildings. A vegetable garden was freshly turned for spring planting, and chickens pecked in a fenced yard. "Pa," Nora called as they approached. "We have a visitor," the door opened, and a tall man with graying hair and a full beard stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. His eyes narrowed at the sight of Zach. "What's this, Nora?" he asked, his voice deep and cautious. "This is Mr. Monroe, Pa." He had a misunderstanding with Jenkins from the Bridger ranch. He's hurt. Thomas Campbell studied Zach with the practiced eye of a man who'd seen his share of drifters and cowboys. "Jenkins is quick with accusations and quicker with that rifle of his," he finally said. "Come in, Monroe. Any man Jenkins dislikes is welcome at my table." Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable, with handcrafted furniture and colorful quilts that spoke of a woman's touch. Nora directed Zach to sit at the kitchen table while she gathered supplies. "My daughter mentioned you're with a cattle drive," Thomas Campbell asked, setting his rifle aside but remaining standing. "Yes, sir. Heading to Fort Benton with 2,000 head. I rode out early to track some strays." Zach winced as Nora began cleaning his wound with water and whiskey. "Sorry," she murmured, her hands gentle despite their firmness. "The Bridger outfit has been pushing boundaries lately," Thomas said, his expression darkening. "Trying to force out smaller homesteaders. We've held this land for 15 years, and they've only been interested since the railroad survey came through last fall." Zach nodded. It was a common enough story throughout the territory's large ranchers squeezing out family farms, especially when railway access promised to increase land values. "Your orchard's impressive," Zach said, partly to distract himself from Nora's ministrations. "Don't see many established ones this far north." Pride softened Thomas's weathered features. "My wife's dream. She brought seedlings all the way from Pennsylvania. Said no proper home was complete without an apple orchard." Sadness flickered across his face. "She didn't live to see them fully mature." "I'm sorry for your loss, sir," Zach said quietly. "It was 8 years ago," Nora interjected, tying off a clean bandage around Zach's arm. "I was 16. Fever took her during a hard winter." The room fell silent except for the ticking of a wooden clock on the mantel. Zach felt the weight of their shared grief. He too knew what it was to lose family. "There," Nora said briskly, breaking the moment. "That should heal fine if you keep it clean." "Much obliged, Miss Campbell." Zach flexed his arm carefully. "I should be getting back before the boss thinks I've deserted." Thomas nodded. "You're welcome to cut through our property to avoid Bridger land. Follow the creek south and you'll reach the main trail without crossing their boundary." As Zach prepared to leave, Nora handed him a bundle wrapped in cloth. "Some biscuits and jerky for your ride back," she explained with a small smile. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, and Zach felt an unexpected jolt of awareness. Nora's cheeks colored slightly, suggesting she'd felt it too. "Perhaps you'll come by again when you're not being shot at, Mr. Monroe," she said, her voice light but her eyes serious. "I'd like that, Miss Campbell," Zach replied, surprising himself with his sincerity. "Maybe I could help with some chores to repay your kindness." Thomas Campbell cleared his throat. "The north fence needs mending before summer if you find yourself with time to spare." It was as close to an invitation as a protective father was likely to give. Zach rode back to the cattle camp with thoughts of green eyes and capable hands occupying his mind. For a man who prided himself on traveling light and unattached, the pull he felt toward the Campbell orchard unsettled him. The cattle drive continued north over the next week, the slow-moving herd making steady progress toward Fort Benton. Each evening, as the cowboys settled around campfires after long days in the saddle, Zach found his gaze drifting eastward toward where he knew the Campbell orchard lay. "You're mighty distracted lately, Monroe," observed Elijah Parker, the trail boss, as they shared coffee one evening. "Something catch your interest in these parts?" Zach shrugged, uncomfortable with the scrutiny. "Just enjoying the country." Parker, a veteran of dozens of drives, laughed knowingly. "Country is it? Wouldn't happen to be wearing a dress, would it?" The other men chuckled, and Zach felt heat rising in his face. "The drive's laying over for 4 days at Eagle Creek, right?" he asked, changing the subject. "That's right." "Cattle need rest before the final push, and we need supplies from town." Zach nodded, already planning his return to the orchard. True to his word, he rode out at dawn 2 days later, a bundle of trade goods coffee, sugar, and calico fabric he'd purchased in silverwater tied behind his saddle. The orchard was transformed in the morning light, apple blossoms now fully opened and buzzing with bees. Zach approached the Campbell homestead with an unfamiliar nervousness fluttering in his stomach. Thomas Campbell was repairing a harness outside the barn when Zach rode up. The older man acknowledged him with a nod that was neither welcoming nor hostile. "Mr. Monroe, didn't expect to see you back this way." "I mentioned helping with that fence," Zach replied, dismounting. "Drive's laying over for a few days." Thomas studied him for a long moment. "Fence tools are in the barn. North boundary needs the most attention." It was acceptance, if not enthusiasm. Zach nodded and began unsaddling his horse. Pa, whose Nora emerged from the cabin, stopping short when she saw Zach. She wore a simple work dress with an apron, her hair braided and pinned up, and Zach thought she looked even more beautiful than he remembered. "Mr. Monroe," she said, composing herself. "You've returned," said I would. He removed his hat, suddenly conscious of his trail-worn appearance. "Brought some supplies from town as thanks for your help." Her smile warmed something inside him that had been cold for longer than he cared to admit. "You'll stay for dinner after you've helped Pa?" she asked. "I'd be honored, Miss Campbell." For the next several hours, Zach worked alongside Thomas repairing the boundary fence. The older man was taciturn but skilled, and Zach found himself respecting his craftsmanship and knowledge of the land. "How long have you been driving cattle, Monroe?" Thomas asked during a break. 8 years, give or take. Started as a wrangler when I was 18, worked my way up." Zach took a drink from his canteen. "Been all over Texas, Kansas, Dakota territory. No place to call home," Zach shrugged. "The trail's been home enough." Thomas regarded him thoughtfully. "A man needs roots eventually." "Maybe so." Zach looked toward the distant orchard, where he could just make out Nora's figure moving among the trees. "Some men take longer to find the right soil, I suppose." Thomas followed his gaze and frowned slightly. "My daughter's not one for cowboy sweet talk, Monroe. She's educated, spent 2 years at a school for young ladies in Helena. Reads Shakespeare and writes poetry, has prospects." "I meant no disrespect, sir," Zach said quickly. "See that you don't." Thomas picked up his hammer again. "She stayed here after her mother died when she could have had an easier life with relatives back east. Chose to help me keep this place going instead. That tells you something about her character." They worked in silence after that, but Zach sensed a shift in the air between them. Thomas had shared something important, a measure of trust extended. When they returned to the homestead, as the sun began its westward descent, delicious aromas wafted from the cabin. Nora had prepared a meal that put the trail cook's efforts to shame: roasted chicken, fresh bread, early spring vegetables, and apple pie for dessert. Over dinner, Zach found himself sharing stories of his travels, encouraged by Nora's genuine interest and thoughtful questions. He told them about the vast Texas plains, the Kansas cattle towns, and the changing landscape as railroads pushed ever westward. "It sounds exciting," Nora said, pouring more coffee. "Seeing so many different places." "It has its moments," Zach admitted, "but there's a sameness to it after a while. Dust and long days, new towns that look like the last ones." "What made you choose such a life?" she asked. Zach hesitated, unaccustomed to speaking of his past. "Didn't have much choice at first. My parents died of cholera when I was 16. Had a younger sister, but we got separated when the authorities in St. Louis sent us to different homes." The old pain surfaced despite his efforts to keep it buried. "I ran away, figured I'd make my own way. Been looking for her ever since whenever I pass through a new town." The sympathy in Nora's eyes held no pity, only understanding. "What's her name?" "Elizabeth. She'd be 22 now." Zach stared into his coffee cup. "Haven't had word of her in nearly 10 years. Thomas cleared his throat. "Hope's a powerful thing, son. Don't let it go." The conversation turned to lighter topics after that, but something had changed. The shared confidences created a bridge between Zach and the Campbells, tentative but real. As the evening ended and Zach prepared to ride back to camp, Nora walked him to where his horse was tethered. "Will you come again before your drive continues north?" she asked, her voice soft in the gathering twilight. "If I'm welcome." "You are." She hesitated, then added, "I'm often in the orchard in the mornings. The blossoms are at their peak now." Zach understood the invitation beneath her words. "I've always been partial to apple blossoms," he said with a smile. He rode back to camp with his thoughts in pleasant disarray, the scent of apple blossoms seeming to follow him through the night. True to his word, Zach returned to the Campbell orchard early the next morning. He found Nora among the trees, a book in her hand, seated on a weathered wooden bench beneath the largest apple tree. She looked up at his approach, her smile welcoming. "You came," said I would. Zach removed his hat, suddenly aware of his unshaven face and dusty clothes. "Hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all." She closed her book, a collection of poetry, he noted, and made room on the bench. "I come here most mornings. It was my mother's favorite place." Zach sat beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. "It's peaceful, different from anywhere I've been." They talked easily, the morning passing in conversation that ranged from books to horses, from childhood memories to dreams for the future. Zach found himself sharing thoughts he'd never voiced to anyone, drawn out by Nora's attentive listening and thoughtful responses. "Do you ever tire of moving, Zach?" she asked as midday approached. It was the first time she'd used his given name, and he found he liked the sound of it on her lips. "More often lately," he admitted. "Been thinking about putting down roots somewhere. Maybe finding work on a ranch instead of just passing through." "What's stopping you?" Zach considered the question. "Habit, maybe, or fear that staying in one place means giving up on finding Elizabeth." Nora nodded thoughtfully. "Or perhaps the right place hasn't appeared yet." Their eyes met, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them: possibility, potential, promise. The moment was broken by Thomas calling from the edge of the orchard. "Nora, rider coming." They rose quickly, Zach instinctively placing himself slightly ahead of Nora as they moved toward the house. A lone horseman approached from the direction of Silverwater, and Zach recognized the Bridger Ranch foreman, Jenkins. "Stay here," he told Nora, but she ignored him, keeping pace as they walked to where Thomas stood watching the approaching rider. Jenkins reined in his horse, his expression sour as he noticed Zach. Well, Monroe, didn't expect to find you here." "What brings you to Campbell land, Jenkins?" Thomas asked, his voice level but unwelcoming. Jenkins shifted in his saddle. "Message from Mr. Bridger. He's making a final offer on your property, Campbell, $3,000 for the whole parcel. Thomas's face hardened. And my answer remains the same, not interested. Might want to reconsider, Jenkins said, his tone implying threat. Railroads coming through and Mr. Bridger's got friends on the commission. Could be your water rights get complicated. Is that a threat? Zach stepped forward, his hand instinctively moving toward his holster. Jenkins sneered. Just passing along information, Cowboy. This ain't your fight. You're on Campbell land, Zach replied evenly. Makes it my concern. A tense silence stretched between them until Jenkins spat and turned his horse. Think about it, Campbell. Offer won't stay open forever. He rode off without looking back. What was that about? Zach asked once Jenkins was out of earshot. Thomas's expression was grim. Richard Bridger's been trying to buy us out since the railroad survey came through. Our land sits on what would be the most direct route from Silverwater to the main line. He's been getting more aggressive, Nora added. First it was friendly offers, then hints about how difficult life could get for us. Has he threatened you directly? Zach felt anger rising at the thought. Nothing we can prove, Thomas said. But cattle in our crops, fences cut, warnings from merchants in town that they can't extend credit anymore. Zach had seen such tactics before, large ranchers squeezing out smaller landowners, usually with the tacit approval of local officials who stood to profit from development. The drive moves on in 2 days, he said. I can stay behind, help keep watch. Thomas shook his head. This is our fight, Monroe. Been dealing with Bridger's kind for years. Pa, Nora said softly, we could use the help. Thomas looked between his daughter and Zach, something unreadable in his expression. Finally, he nodded. Talk to your trail boss. If he'll release you, we could use an extra hand until after the Railroad Commission makes its decision next month. That evening, Zach approached Elijah Parker with his request. The trail boss listened silently, puffing on his pipe. Campbell's a good man, Parker said finally. Helped some of our boys during that blizzard 2 years back when they got separated from the herd. Zach hadn't known this connection. So you'll let me stay? Parker studied him. You sure this is about helping Campbell with his trouble and not about his pretty daughter? Zach felt his face warm. It's both, he admitted. I can't explain it, Parker, but something about that place, about her, it feels right. The older man nodded slowly. Been riding with you 6 seasons, Monroe. Never known you to ask for anything like this before. He tapped his pipe against his boot. Take your pay and stay if that's what you want. Position will be open if you change your mind come fall drive. The next morning, Zach rode to the Campbell homestead with his few possessions packed behind his saddle. Thomas met him at the barn, his expression guarded but accepting. Parker explained the situation, Zach said. I'm yours until the railroad matter's settled if you'll have me. Thomas nodded. Could use help with the spring planting, and an extra gun won't hurt if Bridger tries anything. He gestured toward a small cabin behind the main house. You can bunk there. Used to be for hired hands when we had more acreage under cultivation. The cabin was simple, but sound a single room with a bed, table, chair, and small stove. Through the window, Zach could see the orchard in the distance, pink-white blossoms swaying in the spring breeze. For the first time in years, he unpacked his saddlebags completely, arranging his few possessions on the rough shelves. The sensation was strange, both unsettling and oddly satisfying. Nora appeared at the open doorway, a bundle of linens in her arms. To make it more comfortable, she explained, crossing the threshold with a hint of shyness. Thank you. Zach took the bundle, their fingers brushing. Your father's being generous, letting me stay. He trusts you, she said simply, and we do need the help. As she turned to leave, Zach spoke again. Nora, she paused, looking back at him, I want you to know I'm not just staying because of Bridger. Her eyes softened and a smile touched her lips. I know. The words were quiet but certain. In the days that followed, Zach settled into the rhythm of life at the Campbell homestead. The work was hard but satisfying, planting fields, repairing winter damage, tending to the small herd of cattle and horses. Each evening, he joined Thomas and Nora for dinner, the conversation flowing more easily as they grew accustomed to his presence. Most precious were the moments in the orchard with Nora. As spring advanced, they established a pattern of meeting there early in the morning or in the golden hour before sunset. Sometimes they talked for hours. Other times they worked side by side in comfortable silence, pruning trees or gathering fallen branches. On a particularly fine evening 2 weeks after Zach's arrival, they sat beneath what Nora called the mother tree, the oldest apple tree in the orchard, its gnarled branches spreading wide. "My mother used to say this tree had stories to tell," Nora said, leaning her head back against the trunk. "That it remembered the first settlers, the harsh winters, the good harvests." "Do you believe that?" Zach asked, watching how the setting sun gilded her profile. "I like to think so." She turned to face him. "What about you? Do you believe things can hold memories, histories?" Zach considered this, never thought about it much, but this place. He gestured to the orchard around them. "It does feel like it has its own story." "And now you're part of it," Nora said softly. The air between them seemed to still, charged with unspoken feelings. Slowly, hesitantly, Zach reached for her hand. Nora's fingers interlaced with his, warm and certain. "I never expected to find something like this," he admitted, his voice low. "Someone like you, nor I you." Her green eyes met his, unwavering. "A cowboy riding into my orchard being shot at." Zach laughed. "Not my finest moment." "I disagree." Nora squeezed his hand. "It brought you here." The temptation to kiss her was overwhelming, but Zach restrained himself, mindful of the respect due to both Nora and her father. Instead, he brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss against her knuckles. "When the apple trees bloom next spring," he said, the words emerging from someplace deep inside him, "I want to be here to see it. With you." It was a promise not just to stay through the current crisis, but beyond. Nora's eyes brightened with understanding, and her smile held the warmth of summer yet to come. "I would like that very much," she whispered. Their idyll was interrupted the next morning by the sound of horses approaching. Zach was splitting wood while Thomas and Nora worked in the vegetable garden when 3 riders appeared: Jenkins, and 2 rough-looking men Zach didn't recognize. Thomas straightened, wiping his hands on his trousers as he moved to stand between the riders and Nora. Zach set down his axe and walked over, deliberately casual but alert. "What brings you here, Jenkins?" Thomas asked. Jenkins remained mounted, looking down at them with poorly concealed contempt. "Mr. Bridger's patience is running thin, Campbell. He sent me to make one last offer, 3,500, cash in hand." "And I told Bridger my land isn't for sale," Thomas replied evenly. "Not at any price." One of the other riders spat tobacco juice. "Mighty stubborn for a man in your position, Campbell." Zach stepped forward. "What position would that be?" The rider sized him up. "Isolated, outnumbered, one bad accident away from losing everything." The threat hung in the air, blatant and ugly. Zach's hand moved toward his gun. "That sounds an awful lot like a threat," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Might want to reconsider your words." Jenkins's eyes narrowed. "Still here, Monroe. Thought you'd be halfway to Canada with that cattle drive by now. Found reasons to stay." Zach's stance shifted subtly, ready for trouble. Thomas broke the tension. "You've delivered your message, Jenkins. Now ride out. My answer hasn't changed." For a tense moment, it seemed the Bridger men might push further. Then Jenkins nodded curtly. "Have it your way, Campbell, but don't say you weren't warned." He turned his horse, his companions following reluctantly. As they rode away, Nora moved to stand beside Zach and her father. "They won't stop, will they?" "No," Thomas said grimly, "but neither will we." That evening, as they discussed strategy over dinner, Thomas revealed more about their situation. "The Railroad Commission meets in Helena next month to finalize the route. Bridger's been bribing officials to run the line through his property, but the most logical route crosses our land." "Can't you appeal to the commission directly?" Zach asked. "Planning to," Thomas replied. "Got a hearing scheduled in 3 weeks, but Bridger will try to make sure we don't make it there." Or that we have nothing to return to, Nora added quietly. Zach thought of the orchards, the fields ready for planting, the home Thomas and his wife had built from nothing. We'll take turns keeping watch, he said. And I'll ride into town tomorrow, let Sheriff Davis know about Jenkins' threats. Thomas snorted. Davis is in Bridger's pocket, has been for years. Still worth documenting the threats, Zach insisted. And I have friends passing through with the cattle drives. Word gets around about men like Bridger. That night, Zach took the first watch, patrolling the boundaries of the Campbell property with a rifle slung over his shoulder. The land lay peaceful under moonlight, the orchard a silvery haze in the distance. Hard to believe such beauty could be the center of such ugliness. Near midnight, Nora brought him coffee, appearing silently beside him as he stood at the edge of the orchard. You should be asleep, he said, though he was glad for her company. Couldn't. She handed him the steaming cup. Too much thinking. They stood in companionable silence, looking out over the moonlit land. Is it worth it? Zach finally asked. All this trouble for this piece of land. Nora was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. When she did, her voice was thoughtful. This isn't just land to us, Zach, it's everything. Every tree in that orchard has a memory attached. Every field represents years of work. My mother is buried on that hill. She pointed to a small rise beyond the orchard. This is where I learned to walk, to read, to become who I am. How can we put a price on that? Zach nodded, understanding in a way he hadn't before. His own rootless existence suddenly seemed hollow compared to the rich history the Campbells had created here. We won't let them take it, he promised, taking her hand. The following days settled into a vigilant routine. Zach and Thomas took turns watching for trouble while continuing the necessary spring work. Nora rode into Silverwater for supplies, returning with gossip about Bridger's increasing frustration and rumors of hired guns arriving from Wyoming. A week after Jenkins' visit, the first direct attack came a fire set in the south pasture during the night. Zach spotted the flames while on watch and roused Thomas and Nora. Together, they fought the blaze for hours, finally containing it before it could reach the house or orchard. As dawn broke, they surveyed the damage, several acres of pasture destroyed, but the buildings and crops spared. Could have been much worse, Thomas said, his face smoke-stained and grim. This is just the beginning, Zach warned. They're testing us. Nora, exhausted but determined, nodded. Then we'll show them we're not easily broken. The next attack came 2 days later, shots fired at Thomas while he worked in the north field. He escaped unharmed, but the message was clear. Nowhere on their property was safe. That evening, as they discussed their dwindling options, a rider approached from town. Jim Bailey, the telegraph operator from Silverwater and one of the few townspeople not cowed by Bridger's influence. Brought this for you, Tom, Bailey said, handing over a telegram. Figured you wouldn't want to come into town with things being what they are. Thomas read the message, his expression lightening for the first time in days. It's from Judge Harmon in Helena. He's agreed to hear our case against Bridger early next week instead of at the end of the month. That's something, at least, Zach said. Bridger must not have gotten to him yet. Harmon's honest, Bailey confirmed. One of the few, but getting to Helena might be tricky. Word is Bridger's got men watching the roads. After Bailey departed, they formed a plan. Thomas would leave for Helena before dawn, taking a roundabout route to avoid ambush. Zach and Nora would remain to protect the homestead. I don't like leaving you, Thomas told his daughter as he prepared to depart. We'll be fine, Pa, Nora assured him, though her eyes betrayed her concern. Zach will keep watch and I can handle a rifle if needed. Thomas turned to Zach. You protect her with your life, Monroe. Yes, sir, Zach replied solemnly. You have my word. After Thomas rode out in the pre-dawn darkness, Zach and Nora faced each other across the kitchen table, both aware of the intimacy created by their circumstances. We should set up watches, Zach said, breaking the silence. 4 hours on, 4 off, Nora nodded. I'll take first watch while you rest. You were up all night. Zach began to protest but stopped himself, recognizing her need to contribute. "Wake me at noon, then, and Nora," he caught her hand as she turned to go. "At the first sign of trouble, you come get me, no heroics." Her fingers squeezed his. "Same goes for you, Cowboy." The first day passed uneventfully, but Zach's instincts told him the calm wouldn't last. Sure enough, near sunset, he spotted riders on the ridge to the west, at least 5 men watching the homestead. "They're making sure your father's gone," he told Nora as they prepared for night. "They'll come soon." Nora's face was pale but resolute. "What should we do?" Zach considered their options. "We can't defend the whole property, we concentrate on the house and barn. If they fire the fields or pastures, we let them burn." "And the orchard?" Nora asked, her voice tight. Zach met her eyes. "We'll do everything we can to protect it." They prepared through the night, moving valuables to the root cellar, filling water barrels in case of fire, checking and loading every weapon in the house. As they worked, Zach was struck by Nora's quiet efficiency, her hands steady despite the danger. In the small hours of the morning, as they sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee, Nora suddenly reached across and took his hand. "Zach," she said, her voice low and urgent, "if something happens tomorrow, I want you to know that meeting you has been the most unexpected joy of my life." The raw honesty in her words caught him off guard. "Nora, nothing's going to happen, we don't know that," she interrupted, "and I couldn't bear it if—" She trailed off, emotion catching in her throat. Zach moved around the table and knelt beside her chair, taking both her hands in his. "Listen to me. We're going to get through this, and when it's over, when your father returns with the judge's ruling, I'm going to ask him for permission to court you properly." Her eyes widened. "You are?" "Yes," he smiled, certainty filling him. "I've been thinking about it since that first day in the orchard. I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you." Tears glistened in her eyes. "I feel the same." Zach reached up to cup her cheek. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle at first, then deepened as Nora responded, her hands coming up to frame his face. When they finally parted, Zach rested his forehead against hers. "That's a promise," he whispered. "For after." They spent the remainder of the night in their separate rooms, but something fundamental had shifted between them, a commitment made, a future glimpsed. Dawn broke clear and cool, the spring air carrying the scent of apple blossoms. Zach stood on the porch, scanning the horizon for movement. Nothing yet, but the stillness felt ominous. Nora joined him, a rifle in her hands. "When do you think they'll come?" "Soon. They'll want daylight for whatever they're planning." He glanced at her. "You remember what we discussed? If things go badly, you head for the root cellar. The entrance is hidden enough that I'm not hiding while you face them alone," she interrupted firmly. Zach recognized the futility of arguing. "Then we stick together, no matter what." The attack began just after 9 o'clock. 6 riders approached from the west, not bothering to conceal themselves. Jenkins rode at the front, beside a man Zach recognized as Richard Bridger himself, a heavy-set man with a florid face and expensive clothes. "They're confident," Zach muttered, "coming in the open like that." "Should we wait for them to make the first move?" Nora asked, positioning herself behind a stack of firewood with a clear view of the approaching men. "No," Zach decided. "We show them we're ready. Maybe they'll reconsider." He stepped out onto the porch, rifle held ready but not aimed. "That's far enough, Bridger." The riders halted about 50 yards from the house. Bridger urged his horse a few steps forward. "Where's Campbell?" he called. "Not here," Zach replied. "And you're trespassing." Bridger laughed, the sound carrying across the yard. "Won't be trespassing for long. This land will be mine by sundown." "My father's in Helena," Nora called out, stepping up beside Zach. "Meeting with Judge Harmon about your illegal attempts to seize our property." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Bridger's face, quickly masked. "Harmon can't help you, girl. This territory runs on progress, not sentiment. That railroad's coming through, and it's coming through here." "Not your decision to make," Zach said evenly. "Now ride out before this gets ugly." Bridger's expression hardened. "Jenkins, convince them." Jenkins raised his rifle, but Zach was faster. He fired a warning shot that kicked up dirt near the foreman's horse, causing it to rear in panic. "Next one won't miss," Zach called. "You men want to die for Bridger's greed, because that's what'll happen if you come any closer." Two of the riders exchanged uneasy glances. They hadn't signed on for a pitched battle against determined defenders. Bridger, seeing his men's hesitation, changed tactics. "I'm a reasonable man, Miss Campbell. Your father's not here to make decisions, but you are. $5,000 my final offer, enough to start fresh somewhere else, somewhere better than this God-forsaken wilderness." "This land is not for sale," Nora replied, her voice steady. "Not for any price. My mother is buried here. Our lives are here." "Sentiment," Bridger spat. "Look around you, girl. Progress is coming whether you like it or not. You're standing in its way." "Seems to me," Zach interjected, "if your railroad route was really the best one, you wouldn't need to resort to threats and intimidation to secure it." A murmur of agreement came from one of Bridger's men, quickly silenced by a glare from Jenkins. Bridger's face darkened with anger. "Enough talking. Jenkins, burn them out. Start with the orchard." The words hit Nora like a physical blow. "No." She cried as Jenkins and two men wheeled their horses toward the apple trees, torches now visible in their hands. Zach raised his rifle. "Nora, stay here. I'll stop them." "I'm coming with you," she insisted, already moving toward the orchard. They ran across the open ground, exposed and vulnerable. Behind them, Bridger shouted orders to his remaining men. Gunfire erupted, bullets kicking up dirt around them as they reached the relative safety of the orchard's edge. Jenkins and his men had already dismounted, moving among the trees with lit torches. The morning breeze would carry flames quickly through the closely planted trees. "Stop!" Nora shouted, raising her rifle. Jenkins turned, his face twisted with malice. "Orders are orders, Miss Campbell." He lowered his torch toward a pile of dead leaves and branches. Zach fired, the bullet splintering bark inches from Jenkins' head. The foreman jerked back, dropping the torch, which Nora quickly stamped out. The other men hesitated, caught between Bridger's orders and the determined defense. "Your boss is back there, safe behind his men," Zach called to them. "While you're here doing his dirty work. Is burning a woman's orchard worth dying for?" One of the men, little more than a boy, really lowered his torch. "This ain't right, Jenkins. Burning out a homestead ain't what I signed on for." "Shut up and do your job," Jenkins snarled, drawing his pistol. What happened next unfolded in heartbeats. Jenkins aimed at Zach, who dove for cover behind a tree trunk. Nora fired, her shot going wide but causing Jenkins to redirect his aim toward her. Zach emerged from cover and fired twice in rapid succession. Jenkins staggered, then fell, his pistol discharging harmlessly into the ground. The remaining men threw down their torches and raised their hands. "Don't shoot," one called. "We're done here." From beyond the orchard came the sound of more gunfire and shouting. Zach and Nora exchanged puzzled glances. "Stay with them," Zach told Nora, indicating the surrendered men. "I'll check it out." Moving cautiously through the orchard, Zach emerged to a surprising scene. Bridger and his remaining man were surrounded by at least a dozen riders cowboys from the Hartwell outfit that Zach had traveled with, led by Elijah Parker himself. "Parker," Zach called, stepping into the open. "Your timing's impeccable," the trail boss grinned. "Heard in town there might be trouble out this way. Thought we'd see if our former colleague needed a hand." Bridger, his face purple with rage, spluttered, "This is outrageous. I'll have the law on all of you for trespassing." "Funny thing about that," came a new voice, and Thomas Campbell rode forward from among the cowboys. Beside him was a distinguished-looking man in a formal suit, Judge Harmon. "The law's already here, Bridger." As the standoff resolved into arrest and explanations, Nora rushed to her father, embracing him fiercely. "You're early. How did you know?" Met the judge in Silverwater, Thomas explained. He was already on his way to investigate complaints about Bridger. "We heard in town about Bridger gathering men, so I rounded up some help." He nodded toward Parker and his cowboys. Judge Harmon stepped forward, his bearing authoritative despite trail dust. "Mr. Bridger, I've received numerous complaints about your tactics regarding the railroad right-of-way. Based on what I've witnessed today and the sworn statements I've collected, you're facing serious charges of intimidation, destruction of property, and attempted murder." Bridger wilted visibly as his empire of influence crumbled before him. As the judge continued listing charges, Zach moved to Nora's side, taking her hand discreetly. "The orchard?" Thomas asked, noticing the gesture but saying nothing about it. "Safe," Nora replied. "Thanks to Zach." Thomas extended his hand to the cowboy. "Seems I owe you more than I can repay, Monroe." "No debt between friends, sir," Zach replied, shaking his hand firmly. As Bridger and his men were led away, the tension of the past weeks finally broke. Parker and his cowboys accepted Thomas's invitation to stay for a meal, and soon the homestead buzzed with activity and celebration. In the midst of the impromptu gathering, Zach found a moment alone with Thomas. "Sir," he began, "I'd like your permission to court your daughter." Thomas studied him, his expression unreadable. "You planning to move on once the next cattle drive comes through?" "No, sir," Zach answered without hesitation. "I'm done drifting. If you'll have me, I'd like to stay on here, learn the orchard business, build something lasting." A slow smile spread across Thomas's weathered face. "Wondered how long it would take you to figure that out." He clasped Zach's shoulder. "You have my blessing, son, but Nora makes her own decisions, always has." "I'm counting on it, sir." Later, as the celebration wound down, Zach found Nora in the orchard, standing beneath the mother tree. Dappled sunlight played across her face as she looked up at the blossoms overhead. "Your father gave his blessing," Zach said, approaching her, "for me to court you properly." Nora's smile outshone the spring sunshine. "Did he now? And what if I don't wish to be courted?" Zach's heart stuttered until he caught the teasing glint in her eye. "Then I'd have to convince you otherwise, Miss Campbell." He stepped closer. "Starting with reminding you of a promise made beneath these very trees." "What promise was that, Mr. Monroe?" she asked, her voice soft as she moved into his embrace. "That when the apple trees bloom next spring," he murmured, stroking her cheek, "I'd be here to see it. With you." "A fine promise," she agreed, her arms encircling his waist. "But why wait for next spring when this one's so beautiful?" Their kiss was unhurried, full of promise and possibility. When they finally parted, Zach kept hold of her hand, unwilling to break the connection. "I want to show you something," he said, leading her deeper into the orchard. Near the eastern edge, where the oldest trees gave way to newer plantings, Zach stopped beside a young apple sapling he'd helped Thomas plant days earlier. "Your father told me about a tradition your mother started," he explained. "Planting a new tree to mark important occasions." Nora's eyes widened in understanding. "This one, for us," Zach confirmed. "For our beginning, if you'll have me." Tears glistened in her eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll have you, Zachary Monroe." They stood together beside the sapling, hands clasped, as the sun began its descent behind the western mountains. The orchard around them hummed with life and possibility, bees among the blossoms, birds returning to their nests, the promise of fruit to come. "Tell me about next spring," Nora said, leaning against him. "What will it bring?" Zach smiled, his arm around her waist. "These blossoms will have become fruit, the harvest will be in, perhaps we'll have our own cabin by then." "Our own land, this is our land," he corrected gently. "Your father's making me a partner in the orchard business, said I have a knack for it." Nora laughed, the sound like music in the quiet orchard. "A cowboy with a knack for growing things. Who would have thought?" "Not me," Zach admitted. "Not until I met you." As twilight descended, they walked hand in hand back toward the homestead, the path before them clear and bright with promise. 1 year later, the Campbell-Monroe orchard celebrated its most abundant harvest in memory. The railroad had chosen an alternate route that bypassed both the Campbell homestead and Bridger land, following Judge Harmon's recommendation for a more direct path further west. Zach and Nora, married since the previous autumn, worked side by side gathering the last of the season's apples. Their cabin, built on the eastern edge of the orchard, stood ready for the coming winter, smoke curling from its chimney against the crisp fall air. "Quite a year," Thomas remarked as they loaded the final wagon of apples bound for market in Silverwater. "Best crop we've ever had." "Good land, good care," Zach replied, helping his father-in-law secure the load. "And good fortune in our partners." He nodded toward a group of Hartwell cowboys who had settled in the area, forming a cooperative with the Campbells to market their produce to the mining camps and growing settlements throughout the territory. Thomas smiled. "Speaking of partners, where's that daughter of mine?" "At the mother tree," Zach answered, his expression softening. "Said she needed a moment." Thomas nodded in understanding. "Go on, then. I'll finish here." Zach found Nora where he knew she would be, seated on the bench beneath the ancient apple tree. Her hands rested protectively over her slightly rounded belly, her face peaceful as she gazed up at the branches now heavy with fruit. "Telling stories to our little one?" Zach asked, sitting beside her. Nora smiled. "About her grandmother, about how this orchard came to be." She took his hand, placing it over the gentle swell where their child grew. "About how her father rode in one spring morning being shot at and changed everything," Zach laughed. "Not my most dignified moment. But the most important," Nora countered, leaning against him, "for all of us." As the autumn sun cast long shadows across the orchard, they sat together in comfortable silence, surrounded by the fruits of their labor and love. The cycle of seasons would continue, harvest giving way to winter's rest, then spring's renewal. And when the apple trees bloomed again, Zach would be there to see it, beside the woman who had shown a rootless cowboy how to plant himself in good soil and grow something lasting. In the orchard where they had first met, where he had first held her hand and promised a new spring, they had found not just each other, but a place to call home.